Good evening. Welcome to our January mental health webinar, Triumph Over Tragedy. Thank you for joining us on this MLK Monday. I'd like to start with a quote by MLK. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. I'd like to turn things over to our chapter president.
Good evening, and thank you, Dr. Hill. I want to offer greetings and a welcome to everyone that's with us this evening. I think we've all been looking forward to, anxiously waiting for tonight's webinar. When you think about tragedy and you think about the path and the journey that it takes to get beyond that tragedy, for a lot of us, you don't know what to expect, and it looks different for everyone. Tragedy comes in all shapes, sizes, and situations. And so you may have had tragedy yourself, experienced it yourself, or you may know of someone that has. And a lot of times you're curious, where do you go? Where do I start? How do I get beyond this point? What do I do? Who can I talk to? Who can I talk to that may really understand? We hope that tonight's session gives you an idea of what exactly constitutes a tragedy, but what does one do when you're trying to move forward and you feel like you are really just at a stumbling place? Please don't hesitate to ask your questions. I would guarantee you, if it's a question that you have, there's probably others that are on the webinar with us this evening that has that same question. And on that note, I will turn it over to Nadia Barnett.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate the welcome message from Dr. Cherie Hill and from our chapter president, Sabrina Clark. Thank you for the introduction into our topic. And we have two wonderful dynamic women here that are going to help us in having this discussion tonight. I'm going to begin by first introducing our two panelists, and then we will jump right into to this conversation for this evening. So first we have S. Candy Winfield. She's a licensed professional counselor, a national certified counselor, distance credentialed counselor who's been in the field for over 20 years. She has a master's in clinical psychology and completed graduate work at Richmond University, where she studied the integration of psychology and theology. She received a diploma in Christian counseling. She's had extensive experience in working with families that are in crisis and stabilizing those families that have had to deal with issues such as substance abuse, domestic violence, sexual abuse. She's also astute in working with couples addressing communication issues, infidelity, broken trust, and bringing couples out of the destructive tit-for-tat cycle. Ms. Winfield is a skilled trainer, lecturer, and workshop presenter who also owns her own private practice called Suddenly Professional Counseling Consulting. She provides counseling services to churches as well as crisis intervention services. She focuses on presenting and discussing sensitive topics such as the topic that we have this evening, along with domestic violence, substance abuse, and suicide. Ms. Winfield developed and created her own innovative services such as intensive couple unification, where she works with couples on bringing them out of destructive habits and cycles. She is a developer of a therapeutic walk called Be a Queen, which is a best-selling book that you can find on Amazon. In addition, her work with women, a women's group called Sister Circle for Queens, has addressed topics such as what we have tonight, in addition to self-defeating thoughts, and focus on empowering women to be their best selves. Currently, Ms. Winfield's interest with her practice is individual therapy with both men and women, addressing family of origin issues, interpersonal problems, premarital and marital and family therapy. Thank you, Ms. Winfield.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Looking forward to this discussion.
Absolutely. Our next panelist is Ms. Elaine Neal, which is a young woman who is native of Syracuse, New York, graduated magna cum laude with a degree in mass media arts, concentrating in television and film production from Clark Atlanta University. While there, Jonquel was a player on the CAU women's basketball team. She was an honor society member and was president of her class. She attended the Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, where she graduated with public service fellow designation and served on law review. She graduated from law school in 2010 and was admitted to practice in Georgia that same year. Ms. Neal previously was employed by one of the largest insurance companies in the country, where she defended the company and its clients in personal injury lawsuits. Prior to that, she was a senior assistant district attorney with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, assigned to Major Crimes Division, where she prosecuted homicides and serious injury by motor vehicle cases. She was also assigned to the Crimes Against Women and Children unit, where she prosecuted sex crimes. Her other prosecutorial work has ranged from fraud, drug trafficking, to other violent crimes. Ms. Neal's role as a lead prosecutor for many jury trials has garnered her many awards for her ability to receive very fast jury verdicts, to include within 10 minutes. Prior to joining the district attorney's office, Jonquel worked in private practice. Her volunteer work has included teaching legal concepts and mock trial techniques to elementary school students. She's a proud member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Women of Clark Atlanta University, and the Georgia Association of Black Women Attorneys. She was inducted into the Who's Who of Black Atlanta in 2017. She has been awarded by the Ohio State University Alumni Association as a Rising Buckeye, and Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated as a public policy change agent for her contributions to her community. We welcome you as well, Ms. Jonquel Neal, and your experience and training to this topic and conversation.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for having me here. It's an honor to be before everyone and just to give, my humble opinions and experiences. And hopefully everyone is able to gain something from what we have to share this evening. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. So we've had a great introduction by Ms. Sabrina Clark on this topic of trauma and tragedy. I would like to start this conversation by asking both of you, how would one know if they are experiencing any residual effects from a traumatic event? What would be some of the signs or symptoms that could be related?
I can start out. I think when we think of trauma, understanding that trauma, when you have trauma, you have basically experienced something that causes a serious threat to your life in terms of safety. It affects you. Trauma by its very nature affects every part of us, emotionally, physically, sexually, psychologically, and mentally. And so that's what causes it to be trauma, because it impacts us in so many ways. And so because of that, some of the residue signs and symptoms can come from any of those areas. Physically, you could be experiencing symptoms in terms of nauseousness, inability to sleep. Emotionally, you could be depressed, anxious. It affects you cognitively. You can be forgetful. And so knowing that trauma kind of affects every part of you. And again, it undermines your sense of safety and your equilibrium. So you just feel off and everything is off. So again, knowing that trauma by its nature affects every part of you, your mind, your body, your spirit. And that's what makes it traumatic, because it's not just one thing, it affects your entire being. And it's ongoing sometimes in terms of the symptoms.
And, one of the things that I, want to add to that, those are all very great things that, that are various signs of trauma. Just from my own personal experience, I know that I was actually speaking on the panel, not only because of, my work with victims of violent crimes such as homicide and rape and child molestations, but also from my own experience, I've had to go through quite a bit of trauma. And one experience was when my younger brother was murdered back in 2016. He was shot in the head coming outside of a convenience store. He was an unintended target, and the case is still unsolved due to that. And so for me, one of the big things that I can say just from my own personal experience, that one of the symptoms that I started to do was to isolate, right? So I naturally have an outward personality disposition. And so that began to change for me. And some people are naturally introverts, and they may even subvert further into isolation. And so isolation is really one of the key things, thinking that you can handle it on your own. And sometimes when you go through traumatic things, you think that, when people see you, they just feel so sympathetic and you just want to go and have a good time. And, and sometimes, you just isolate because you just want to avoid the topic, or because people are just uncomfortable to be around you. Some of the other things that, one of the things that she also mentioned was about anxiety. One of the things about trauma is that even if your mind doesn't know or doesn't register with you that you've been through something traumatic, sometimes it will manifest itself in physical ways. And so you have to be aware, you have to really know yourself, right? And know that there can be physical manifestations of trauma. Like, for instance, I can say, from my own personal experience, around the time that my brother was murdered, I was a prosecutor at that time, and I went back to work too early. And what happened is that I would be in traffic, right? I would be driving down 85 South. It would be very congested, and I would get chest pains from that. And I had never experienced that kind of physical manifestation ever, having a very stressful job day to day. And so, that's some of the other things that, so even if you think in your mind that you are okay to continue on with your day to day, or you just want to be busy, you got to listen to your body, because there will be a physical manifestation that will come about as well. One of the things that I also wanted to just add is also that as it relates to children. So from my experience in the prosecutor's office with those kinds of cases, one of the things that you want to look for in children is a decreased school performance. You will start to see that in children that have been victims of trauma, an inability to sleep, and irritability. And some people get as low as to suicidal, and trauma can really plague on a person's self-worth. And also one of the things that you would see in children, not necessarily adults, is wetting the bed as well. So just in addition to all of those things, I just kind of wanted to add just about, the trauma that those of you that have children or nieces and nephews or school teachers or counselors, just some other things that you can look for. And hopefully I didn't take too long in answering.
Oh, no, thank you. Thank you very much. I think that really leads to the idea that everyone can experience the same event in different ways.
Correct.
And we have all experienced a change in our life over the past 2 years, just with the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And so I think both of you identifying changes in behavior, changes in yourself, is the first place that one should look for something is wrong or something is not right.
Yeah.
Something is off, as Miss Candy shared. And I think that's very, very important. I appreciate Jonquel, you bringing up kids and how a reaction to a traumatic event can be displayed or shown or seen with kids. What could be some of the as it relates to kids or children and adolescents, what are some other things that as parents or teachers that we should be looking for, and not necessarily minimizing, right? Because sometimes I think there's a natural, because we know children and adolescents are resilient, and there's this natural desire to ignore because we don't see, they're not able to say, hey, that was really traumatic for me, or hey, this is not, something, this hurt me, or I can't understand why this is happening. So it is displayed in these other behaviors that we may say, like, why are you not, we're focused on the actual symptom. Why aren't you doing well in school? What's wrong with you? Or, why are you having these accidents? Let's, stop drinking before bed, or whatever it might be. And it really, the symptom becomes the hindrance to the bigger problem.
Mhm. I think in children, sometimes the fear response, if the child, again, has been very active and social, now all of a sudden they don't want to go to a certain place or be around a certain person. We mentioned insomnia, bedwetting, just isolation can be a big one, but mostly fear. They will have this overwhelming fear that wasn't there before. And sometimes they can't tell you why. In the instance of sexual perpetration, sometimes the perpetrator will threaten them if you tell. So they won't speak up and tell you what's wrong. But I think paying attention to fear responses and being hypervigilant, they're very afraid and scared. Really pay attention to that, especially if it wasn't there before.
And just to add to that, one of the big things from what I've seen as a prosecutor in these cases is that, it's really the change in behavior of the child, right? It's the change in their behavior, and whether that is they become more irritable, and and it's kind of an unexplainable irritability. You just don't know where that change in behavior is coming from. Kind of what I mentioned before, specifically for teachers, like, that you have a student that regularly engages in the classroom, and then all of a sudden they start to, speak up less and less and less, and start to become more into a shell. And one of the other things, kids that have been through somewhat of extreme levels of trauma, and of course there's various levels, right? And one of the things that I can say that that I've seen in kids that have been victims of sexual assault specifically, they start to cut on some of them start to cut on their hands. And so that can be a challenge for a teacher to see, but parents have to really be vigilant about, about their children, and paying them very close attention with these changes that tend to occur, because there is going to be a change.
Mm-hmm.
And so and every change is going to be different for every child.
Right.
And in terms of isolating, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Also acting out.
Yes, correct.
All of a sudden they are disobedient, aggressive, and so it can go to either extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I wanted to make sure that we touched on children and adolescents, and I appreciate this, Jonquil, you bringing this up, because as I mentioned, trauma, everyone perceives and receives and reacts to events differently. So even traumas that are generational, that a parent may have experienced, that their child will experience, is the child and the parent are going to react to that same event very, very differently. And so the key is to pay attention. And as Ms. Winfield shared, not let the fear, as in terms of the parent being fearful that someone's going to find out, or that that they did something wrong, not let that fear hinder them from getting their child or children some help. So we have a question that popped up in the chat. When dealing with a loved one who has experienced a significant amount of trauma that they're not acknowledging, what are some of the best ways to be present and supportive in that relationship, especially without being overbearing or invasive?
I think pointing out what you're observing and what you're seeing and letting that person know that this is not normal. I am seeing that you're isolating. I'm seeing that you're drinking or that you're using substances, self-medicating in some form. So just kind of letting them know that you are observing and witnessing changes in their behavior that may be coming from the trauma.
And I can add to that, it's interesting how the question was posed about an individual that's been through a significant amount of trauma and not acknowledging it. So I just want to give an example. I mentioned about in 2016 about how my brother was murdered in 2016, but actually he was the fourth death of that year for me. And so I went through a period of time where I was experiencing a lot of trauma and was not aware of that it was trauma per se. Do you get what I'm saying? Because of course, someone being killed, that is an automatic natural trigger that is a form of trauma, right? But before that, during the beginning of that year, my childhood's best friend, younger sister, who was very close to me in Atlanta, got killed in a car accident down here. And then a couple months later, I had an aunt that had got very ill, and she was in the hospital for 4 or 5 months. And we had to kind of watch her kind of deteriorate until she passed. And so that's traumatic, going to a hospital and watching a loved one go. And then I had another aunt that died within a week of her. And then 4 months later, it was my brother. And all of the while being a prosecutor, trying cases, trying murder cases, trying all kinds of cases, and still, being a functional person. And so there can be periods of time where people go through things that are traumatic, but they are things that happen every day. And so it does not trigger to them that it is traumatic. And so one of the things for me is that I think that it's important that you pay your loved ones very close attention. If there's someone close to you, you are aware of the things that they enjoy doing, that they love doing, and some of the things that they don't, right? So for instance, someone like me, I like to work out all the time. Anyone that would be close to me would know that if I stop working out, that something was wrong or something is going on there. So a healthy way of doing it, and of course you want to point things out, but a lot of us have people in our lives that they don't really do well to people telling them how to live their lives or pointing out things about them, right? So I think that one of the ways is, I noticed that, you love working out. Can we go for a walk? Can we go for a hike on Saturday? I would love to spend time with you. Or, the things that they love that you see are starting to deteriorate or are no longer there, be a part of the solution instead of course, you want to point out that they're not doing that, but how is it that you can play an active role in bringing those activities back? Because if that person is experiencing a level of trauma and they're not aware of it, then they likely lack the motivation to continue on doing the things that are going to be happy for them to do on their own. And so also, that's one of the things that stands out to me. And of course, we have the licensed therapist here on the panel. And, I think that is the paramount number one thing that anyone going through trauma needs to see a therapist. And so we can talk more about that. Sure.
And again, in the discussion, we're talking about behavior change. Mm-hmm. And again, that's what trauma does. It kind of affects how you show up. And so paying attention to changes in behavior, changes in routines, whether it's overdoing or not doing. But again, looking at and paying attention to behavior change in people.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, just in talking about what you can do to help, one of the things that came out is when you see someone using substance or alcohol that can be, or you're seeing them use more or substance or alcohol that can be a result of traumatic events, how you would address that and, make note of that, bring that up in a very sensitive way. Mm-hmm. I think that Ms. Neal, you shared, it's important to know the person, and to once you really know the person, you then will be able to know how they will receive your response to what you see them doing, or you communicating or being reflective in what you see them doing. That's very different. And you know, how do you, as a person that is dealing with trauma, is there a way that, or not dealing with trauma, let me correct that, as a person who has experienced trauma, is there a way to work through your trauma and deal with your trauma without reliving your trauma? That is the question. And that might be where a lot of people stop. A stopping point is the fear of having to relive the trauma. Can you both speak to that for us?
Absolutely. And I think that is when, you know, we cause trauma to become very problematic and pathology, or we talk about PTSD. When you relive or ruminate on the trauma or on the event, we have to realize that that is reliving it. And so sometimes we have to, quote unquote, reframe, and reframing meaning change the outcome. Think about, okay, I had this experience, however, I survived. We have to often move from being a victim of our circumstances and what happened to us, but focusing on the fact that I came out as a victor or victorious. And so as a result of the trauma, what am I going to do differently? What am I going to allow myself to become? How do I then turn this into something proactive? Whether it is being an advocate or changing laws, there are things we have to kind of reframe the trauma in terms of not being something that is devastating and detrimental to me, but it kind of catapults me into being, again, proactive and making something positive out of it. And that kind of rewires our brain in terms of making it not detrimental, but again, causing me to be victorious over it. And we are able to do that because we are in control of our thoughts. And we have to realize that when we relive it, and I think about it over and over again, I am reliving and I'm hardwiring that trauma in my brain. And so we have to realize that our thoughts is not always the circumstance or the situation that has occurred, but what I'm saying to myself about that situation or circumstance that determines whether it's post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic growth from that experience.
One of the things, that's a very interesting question, because I felt like it really came up in my rape cases as a prosecutor, because by the time we got to a trial posture, they would have to testify about, you know, the trauma, the worst day of their life, and they would have to testify about those things. And, you know, one of the biggest things that, you know, just from my experience and my experience on both ends is that seeking professional help from a licensed counselor will really help you with the tools that you need to allow you to get through the day, the week, different life experiences that you will encounter. Because the one thing about trauma is you can't just run and hide from it. It is going to come back and it is going to show up. And you may not see it show up today. You may not notice it until months, but you will see it years down the line. It will come back and it will rear its head. So it's not something that you can run from. Now, everyone deals with trauma in different ways, and everyone does not necessarily feel comfortable talking about things depending on how they process things. Everyone has their own timeline, and it's up to that person to determine when they are ready to take the necessary steps. But the one thing about mental health is, one of my biggest things that I say is that you have to be a champion of your own mental health. You have to fight for your own mental health, and you have to confront the things that have happened to you, because everyone is going to go through trauma at some point, and that's your story, that's your testimony. And so, once those things that have happened to you, they don't define you, but they do shape you, and they affect you. And so, once you start, taking the steps to eradicate that, then, it will, when you talk about these things, it can get to a level where it can be freeing for you, and not necessarily you reliving a traumatic event. And that's when, and honestly, dealing with trauma is an ongoing process, right? So for instance, I'm speaking tonight about my experiences with, from my brother being killed. You have to take the necessary steps to protect yourself. So for instance, his birthday, I do not work on his birthday, right? So I'm not outwardly talking about his birthday, right? Or reliving his birthday, but on his birthday, every year, I get very sad about what happened to him. Okay. And so it will come up and affect you in different ways. And so I take the necessary steps to protect myself. That day is blocked off. You cannot come on my calendar, regardless of what it is. You cannot get on my calendar on that day. And around that time, I start to scale back work, because, I know that internally, I'm in my mind, it's been many years later, I may think that I'm working and that, I'm able to handle it. And then an internal stress will start to happen. And so, once you start taking the steps, you can better protect yourself. And even if you cannot talk about it if you want, because you may think you're reliving it, but there are different days or events and things that will trigger a response from you that will bring up what happened to you. And so I just encourage everyone to fight for your mental health.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. We had a couple of questions that have come up in reference to compounding trauma. So Jonquel describing in 1 year how you had to experience 4 family members passing away in 1 year. How do you, or did you, recover from those? The question is it better to address each of them separately? Or would this be something that a person would address all together? And what steps did you take in addressing just the trauma that you experienced in that 1 year that was very significant?
Yeah, so, at first, and one of the things that I want to start out by saying is why I say you have to fight for your mental health, because literally before that year, and I had experienced other things in my life, and honestly, as a prosecutor, taking in the worst day of everyone's life every day is a form of trauma as well. So I had a lot of compounding traumas, right? And so I was never one to seek out therapy prior to all of those events, but my brother's death, it was so devastating. I think all of them compounding, and then us being so close, it was just so devastating to my core. And I say you have to fight for your mental health because I had actually initially sought out a couple of therapists, and they weren't good fits for me. And so don't just let one instance of it not working out stop you from finding someone that's a great fit for you. And it took me a while. It took me a couple of years to find a therapist that I felt was a good fit for me. And that may not be your journey, but you may come across your first therapist and they may work. It may be a phenomenal match, but you have to, have those things there. And also, I believe that it's a lot of factors that you have to take care of yourself when it comes to trauma. For those that are spiritual, and those that are Christians and that go to church, I think it's very important that you dive into your spiritual foundations, right? Making sure that, you're getting a spiritual feeding weekly, and one that, that you're able to carry with you week to week, in addition to seeking help from a licensed counselor. In addition to that, you also have to take steps of your physical health. you should be depending upon your weight, but most people should ingest a gallon of water a day. Just the small things. Is it the water? What are you intaking as your food? How are you taking care of yourself? And also, there are going to be some times where due to trauma, where you want to know the biggest thing that I had to learn, though, was giving myself grace.
Absolutely.
When you go through trauma, you have to give yourself grace. Yeah. If you don't feel like doing something that day, do not overextend yourself. Do not set boundaries with your loved ones, with your job. You need to have a good rapport with your primary care physician. Mm-hmm. That you're supposed to see every year to monitor your weight, your organ function. Yeah. And if you're having some mental health issues, they will pull you out of work. And some people may need to be pulled out of work for a couple of weeks or forever longer. And in order for that to happen at your job, you need a doctor to pull you out. So you've got to put the things in place that give you the ability to succeed. But the only person that can do that for you is yourself.
Mm-hmm. I agree totally. With all of that. I think realizing that in terms of coping skills, that it's not just one thing, but it's a myriad of things that you have to do. And self-care is so important. All of those things, physically, mentally, emotionally, taking care of yourself, being able, when you are in the bout of trauma, it feels like nothing is going to ever feel good again. Mm-hmm. And so tapping back into what makes you feel good, what brings you joy. You mentioned your spiritual foundation. You have to pull on resources that allow you to be resilient. That can come from your relationships, that can come from your spiritual foundation, that can come from self-care. And self-care becomes very important in the midst of trauma.
What I wanted to add to that is also exercise. Everyone doesn't like going to the gym, but if you can get out 3 days a week and just walk by yourself, and just whether that's a mile or 2-3 days a week, that will take you very far. Also, one of the things that I learned is that, when you're going through a traumatic experience, a lot of people do not know how to deal with you anymore. And a lot of people shut down. When bad things really happen to you, they're so hurt for you, and they're hurt, right? Because the people that are around you and people that care about you, when you go through traumatic things, it's not just you, they're hurting for you. And so they don't really know how to deal with you. A lot of people don't, some people do. And so, one of the things that I learned from a therapist along the way is that you have to tell people what you need from them, If people are calling you too much, or, you've got to establish your boundaries. Tell people how to be there for you, because a lot of them, they don't know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely. So, in this idea about dealing with trauma, finding a therapist, there was a question that came through our Facebook Live in reference to, if you know someone that has experienced trauma and they are severely affected, but they do not want help, is there anything that you can do for that individual?
Yes. There's a lot that you can do for somebody that doesn't want help. I think that you can be there for people and they not take your advice, right? So I think that there's people that, everyone is not going to take your advice, but I think that you have the ability to be there for them. Sometimes, the person may just need just for you to sit there. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people just may need for you to sit there or be a listening ear. Or, or kind of like what I talked about before. Well, a lot of us are not able to go inside churches anymore, but if we weren't in a pandemic, can I invite you to come to church with me, or whatever your place of worship is? Will you attend with me to my place of worship? Or can I invite you to this Zoom call that we're on right now? Mm-hmm. Also, some of the things that I did partake in after my brother's death, I joined like some homicide support groups. I went to some homicide support groups in person. I joined a couple virtual ones. And, a person may not there are different types of support groups for different types of things or different types of traumas. And so those things may be helpful or they may be not, but a person may not interpret that as, seeking, help or assistance, but just going to be around, people that have been through similar circumstances. And sometimes, it's easier to be in a group amongst people that you don't have these established subjective relationships with, when you're around people that are completely objective from you and from your experiences. And so, I think you can certainly be there and support people. You can send them books, you can do all kinds of things to be there for people that, don't want to necessarily follow your advice or that you think is good advice.
Yeah, and I think sometimes when people say they don't want help, they're actually crying for help.
Yes.
And so you don't give up on them, and you do all of the things that Ms. Neal just mentioned. You walk beside them and hold their hand until they're ready. Because with trauma, if you don't address it, it is going to come up in some way, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally, whether it's cognitively. There are going to be indicators that something is wrong and that you need help. So you kind of just walk beside them until they're ready. Sometimes people are afraid to get help and they live in the distress. Another thing that I think is very, very important in terms of getting people to the point of really becoming proactive is they have to accept what has occurred. When we don't accept what happens, we are in a state of distress. And so when you can finally get to say, yes, this awful thing has happened to me and I need to do something. So many times it's just denial that this happened to me. So if I get help, I'm admitting that something happened. And so sometimes the first step is I got to accept that this traumatic, awful, terrific experience or horrific experience happened. And that moves people to a point of being able to intervene and to get the help that they need. So acceptance becomes very important.
If I can just add one other thing is that, also sometimes, depending on what the traumatic event is and depending how that person is or how they respond, is that you sort of what she said is that you have to give people time to process, what has happened to them. I mean, when you said that they don't want to seek specific help, I mean, what timeline are we at when we're talking about that, right? Because, I can only just speak from my own personal experience. I felt like, after my brother's death, I kind of felt like I was like a shell of myself for a very, very long time. I was here, I was able to go to work, I was able to function, but I was like a shell. I naturally smile a lot, but I didn't smile probably for months. So, you just have to give people time to even get their feet supplanted in the ground, and for people that can be however amount of time that it was. But, I felt like it took a couple of years for me to started to feel like I was getting back to like my normal self. I was high functioning, but for me, for how I felt like it took me a couple of years. So.
Absolutely. And, just, it's interesting that the conversation, is shifted to we've been talking about very traumatic events that occurs, but there are some, I guess, more common events that have happened that can cause one to experience trauma. We have two questions that have come up, one in relation to a negative relationship with a parent that has been traumatic, and an experience with divorce. So we're going to take the divorce question first. We have a attendee whose daughter has experienced trauma from a divorce, and she has displayed several of the symptoms that we have discussed earlier. The daughter has seen a therapist, but refused to really be as vulnerable with a therapist as she could. And 4 years later, she's still suffering from the effects of the divorce or the experience of being divorced, and she's withdrawn and she's isolative. So just in, a change in family dynamics and how that is traumatic. And if we can speak to what are some things that we can do to support someone or ourselves that's maybe going through a change. We have lots of family dynamic changes that occur all the time. And we think it's common. We think that people just, move on. But it can be just as traumatic.
Absolutely. And when you think of divorce, there's also this major grief process because divorce is a loss. And so depending on what that circumstance and situation was, it could be that, she married for life and never saw herself being divorced. And so again, we go back to acceptance. Is it that she has not been able to accept that this is where she is in life because I thought I was always going to be married? Never thought that divorce would be a part of my experience. And so it becomes very, very hard to move through it if I can't accept this is where I am, let alone going through the grief process. And also with a divorce, it's not just the loss of a relationship, but you may lose your lifestyle. You may lose your home. There's multiple losses in a divorce. And so it can be very traumatic. But again, getting to a point of accepting this is where I am. And again, reframing, turning it around and being proactive and taking care of yourself through it. And again, as the support people, holding that person's hand as they walk through that and getting them to a point of being able to accept where they are and moving through it.
I also want to add, as it relates to, and it somewhat was from the second question where it was just about kind of family dynamics. Mm-hmm. One of the things, or some of the things that I've seen that has kind of plagued the Black community as it relates to our families is that, due to some of the historical things that have occurred to our race, is that we tend to parent or love out of a place of fear, and things don't come from a place of love. And so there's a lot of trauma that occurs with, from family dynamics passed down from grandparents to parents to children, how they speak to you, how they treat you, and, how they parent. And so, one of the things that, just for me, as it relates to, and some of the things that I've explored is that, really words of affirmation and showing love to various family members, although that may not be what has been bestowed upon you or historically the dynamics within your family, because the people that can hurt you the most are your family. I mean, they're the closest people to you. And so, just having the tools and being able to identify those specific traumas and not pass on some of those negative things that, you've had to endure growing up or throughout your, life with your family dynamics.
Absolutely. And in reference to the relationship within families, the question is, how would you recommend addressing trauma created by a parent, or the specific question is a parent, but like we just talked about, it could be anyone in the family, but that person doesn't believe that they've created an issue or has caused you harm, right? So we have, people in a relationship, one person is feeling harmed by the other, and the other person doesn't feel that they've done anything wrong. Is there, in those circumstances, is it recommended to address the problem with the person that created it, or just address the problem in general?
I think in a situation like that, the person who is being traumatized, you have to set boundaries because we're responsible for ourselves. How people treat us is what we allow. Mm-hmm. And so if she's putting, and again, sometimes in a family situation, particularly a parent, we often feel, but this is my mother, I should go visit my mother every Sunday. But if every Sunday you come out hurt, victimized, grieving, then you have to take responsibility and set boundaries that allow you to be okay and safe, even if it means not interacting and the relationship not being as intact as you would ideally want it to be. So in that situation, I think boundaries are what's necessary to protect and to keep the person from being traumatized over and over again.
Yes, and go ahead. Yes, Ms. Neal.
Well, I was just going to say, and that's a form of emotional abuse. People may not want to coin it as that or say it as that because it's a family member or someone close to you, but that is a form of emotional abuse. And, eventually, if not addressed, it will manifest itself and come out in other ways. And one of the things, kind of what I had just briefly brought up, is that, those kinds of behaviors can be passed down from generation to generation. That one person feeling harm may exhibit that same behavior towards their child, not even knowing that they're doing that, even though they're walking away harmed. And so kind of like similar to what Ms. Winfield said, is that, you've got to establish boundaries. And also, therapy can be very helpful with how to address those specific people that are so close to you. Those can give you the tools that you need that can assist you with building a healthy relationship.
Absolutely. And I think there's this, when we've transitioned into talking about relationships and how trauma can develop with within relationships that we have with people that we love, there's this idea that if this person knew how much it hurt me, they would stop. Or this idea or wish or fantasy that the individual, once they, they're going to respect that it's hurting me. And unfortunately, the re-traumatizing that Ms. Winfield referenced and the emotional abuse that Ms. Neal mentioned, it comes from that individual not respecting those boundaries, not having your wishes and feelings as a priority for them to change their behaviors and interactions. And it really comes down to, are you going to focus on taking care of yourself? Are you going to focus on taking care of keeping a relationship that's not helping you?
Yeah, we're responsible for how people treat us, and people can only do to us what we allow them to do. And again, in therapy is a place where you may learn the skill to be able to set boundaries, appropriate boundaries, or even know. Because in a situation like that, in that home, there may not have been boundaries, which is why that's occurring even into adulthood. And so learning about boundaries, I have some clients that come, they don't even have a concept of healthy boundaries. And so knowing where that line is becomes very, very important in terms of having healthy relationships and reciprocal relationships that are healthy.
Thank you for that. And, in terms of relationships, and there's a couple of questions that came through and going back to children and kids. One has a question in reference to parents that are dealing with traumas, parents that have kids that are dealing with traumas that are blaming themselves. And another question is in reference to children that are traumatized by divorce or traumatized by other maybe non-severe trauma. And if we can speak to the reality of that, and the reality of the self-blaming or feeling guilty, which I think we can all really attest to, that we're all here on this Zoom and we are alive in this pandemic, and there are people that didn't make it, right? And there can be a sense of guilt or feeling guilty that maybe we survived something that other people didn't, or that someone is experiencing a trauma that maybe they feel they were responsible for. And so 2 questions in reference to one, speaking in reference to the blaming yourself, how to move out of blaming yourself for trauma that occurred for someone else that you may feel responsible or guilty for. And the other, how trauma such as change in lifestyle, divorce, can impact children. Either one.
Okay. In terms of as a parent, you are responsible for our children. And so when something happens to our children, whether it's an accident or sexual molestation or, an injury, we automatically are going to feel responsible. And so I think that is an emotion that you just have to work through and understand that it is a feeling. Don't get stuck in the feeling, move past it, and again, become proactive as a result of this happening. What am I going to do different? How are we going to move forward? And what needs to change? What do I need to implement? What do I need to strategize to make sure that I'm not in this situation again? So again, I'm always focused on how do we move forward and what do we need to do different that is going to allow me not to be in this situation again. So I think most of the focus has to be on that rather than sitting in the feeling, because that's an emotion that you're going to feel because you are the parent, but you don't sit in it and you don't dwell in it. You use it to catapult you to where you need to be and the changes that need to be made. Don't sit in that feeling.
And in reference to children that are experiencing trauma from changes, it could be moving, right? You decide as a family that you're going to move, and it's at a critical point in a child's life, such as middle school or high school. That can be traumatic. Divorce, that's traumatic. Remarrying someone else, that can be traumatic. As a parent, being responsible for your child and supporting your child through these life changes that can occur, what are some things that parents can do, or what are some suggestions that a parent can do, which is, as Ms. Wimpfield mentioned, in order to move, you have to remove yourself, right? Removing yourself as the focus. If the focus is getting your child some help, if the focus is to support or help your child, in those moments, you cannot be focused on being stuck in that space.
In a situation like that, I think, number one, we can use it as a teaching opportunity. As parents, our responsibility is to equip them to be successful adults. So you use it as a teaching opportunity that change happens. And sometimes it's not the change that we want, or it's not when we want it. But in that change, you try to normalize and replace those things that the child is grieving, or the things that are no longer going to be there. Whether it's friendships, whether it's a pet, because sometimes you might lose a pet in a move or in a divorce. And so looking at what can be replaced, how do you, again, use this and teach your child that these are the things that life presents, kind of depending on the age, and you present it at an age appropriate level. But knowing that things aren't going to stay the same. And then again, kind of focusing on how do we replace, how do we normalize, how do we stabilize this situation? I think in divorce situations, children are always looking to the parent to determine whether or not I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the divorce comes with a lot of strife and conflict, that is going to traumatize the child. However, if the parents continue to co-parent and have a cooperative and a collaborative relationship, that a divorce does not cause one parent to no longer be there, you have to really, really kind of talk about and create, again, what is going to be the new normal, and try to stabilize and normalize this experience as much as you can. And that's the responsibility of the parent. And so parents often get caught up in their own feelings, whether it's the grief, whether it's, the anger that then gets transferred onto the children. As the children are going to pick up and have the energy that the parents are presenting during that divorce. So remembering to keep the children and their mental health as a priority.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have. So another question in the chat in reference to compartmentalizing. So experiencing trauma, you begin to, okay, I'm going to go to work. So let me make sure I go to work and leave all my personal personal experiences and personal things at home when I'm at home. This strategy that we all use it at times to certain degrees for to be successful. How do you push through compartmentalizing yourself, your emotions, and pushing down feeling in order to get to healing that trauma, healing through the trauma?
Well, one thing I can say is that, you also have to keep in mind that a lot of people encounter trauma even when they go to work. So not only do you have personal trauma that you're having to deal with, then you're walking into a stressful work environment. I think there's a lot of studies and articles out there about stressful and toxic work environments.
Absolutely.
You have a lot of people that are overworked, although they're at home during the pandemic. The employers are putting double the work on you because you're not traveling, you don't have a commute. And so you have more work now than you ever did before when you were going into the office. And so number one, one of the biggest things I think about as it works to the workplace is that not only do you have to establish boundaries, in your personal life and with your family members and friends, you have to establish boundaries at work. If it gets to a certain point that your personal life trauma or the things that you're going through is getting to a too high of a level, and you're having a difficulty coping, you're not forced to go into work and to perform in this extremely stressful environment. I mean, you can make requests to individuals that they need to scale back. And I don't know what that entails as it relates to anyone's respective profession. However, there are ways that you should be able to scale back your work. And if they're not conducive to doing that, then how can you go about changing that environment? Because you want to be in a workplace where when you are going through a challenging time, that they are able to be flexible and to work with you. A lot of people also have to deal with coworkers or specific managers or people in management that they feel are inhibiting their success or that make their job extraordinarily difficult. And so, with those things you have to keep, and those are traumas. And so a lot of times what people will do is they'll go and they'll get another job. But if you don't address the traumas that happen at that job, when you go on, it's going to follow you into the next job. And so there may be a situation where something may be similar to happen to you in the past, and your response is not commensurate with what happened. And that's because it's a trigger for what was done to you at your last job or 2 or 3 jobs ago. And so, it's a lot of moving parts. And so we try to compartmentalize and say, hey, I'm at work today. These other things don't bother me. But then you have the challenges that present themselves with you at work. And so, it's about establishing boundaries, and just being aware of when you have too much being thrown at you at one time.
And the other thing in terms of overworking or using work as an escape to get away from the trauma is that when you leave work, it's still there. And so you begin not functioning at home and not functioning, in your other circles that you're moving in. And eventually, and that's the thing about trauma, it's going to show up in a way that causes you to have to pay attention to it and address it. There is going to be something out of balance. And so if you're overworking and staying at work 12 hours, not to deal with going home or not to deal, because when I'm home, I'm thinking about it.
Right.
And so it may work for a while, but over time and eventually it's not going to work. And so compartmentalizing it is kind of a misnomer because it's still there.
Absolutely. And, what are, we've talked about trauma, the types of trauma from extreme to more of the norm with children, adolescents, and adults. We've talked about traumas in relationship. What would be your recommendations or suggestions for how a person would begin to confront the issue? So if they know and they recognize, okay, I know that this is an issue for me, or this is a trigger for me because of this event that I've experienced. What's the first thing that a person can do if they're willing, right? They're willing to do something. They might still be afraid. They may have some anxiety, but what is the first thing that they can do to get help?
This may sound self-serving, but talk to a therapist. I think that people, and we have to, and this forum is about removing the stigma of therapy. And we have to get past the stigma or the fact that people will say, oh, I'm not crazy, I don't need to talk to a therapist. And I always say, and use the analogy, if you fall and break your leg, you're going to go to an orthopod who is going to put a cast on it. You may have to walk on a crutch, and then you may move to a boot before that wound heals. Well, the same thing with our emotional wounds, our broken hearts, our losses, our traumas. We have to go to someone who helps assist us, put us on a crutch until we're able to walk on our own. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have got to move past feeling like talking to a therapist or talking to a professional about my emotional and mental health means that I'm crazy. It doesn't. It just means you're human. You're human.
Right. And even, for my work in the district attorney's office, and we're talking about, of course, what we would be on the higher end of extreme traumas, is that we have an entire victim witness assistant unit where it's a unit that is specifically dedicated to provide victims of abuse, of other types of crimes with the resources so that they are able to cope with life. And it's a reason why therapy is on there. And so, the one thing about it is that, a lot of the things that until a person goes to therapy, I'm not sure that you'll have the tools to know what specific things from your childhood affect why you endure things the way that you do now and why you respond to the specific traumas that you respond to and in that way. It is not until you take the time and you explore the various relationships in your life, and as it relates to the difficult or challenging things that you go through your life and the roles that all these people have played and all of the roles that all your life experiences have played, and what is the best way for you to go forward with dealing with trauma. And while we can list out all of the things that holistically are on a higher level that you need to do for yourself, until you do those type of deep explorations, I kind of see it as walking in the dark.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And are there ways that a person can get help if they don't have access to a therapist?
Support groups. Many support groups moved online.
Right.
Many support groups are free, particularly those that are kind of associated sometimes with psychiatric facilities. They have all types of support groups. So if they're not willing and they can't afford therapy, I would suggest a support group.
And also, in addition to that, your friends and family are not, they may not be licensed therapists, but those that you respect and that you trust and, that you feel comfortable sharing, those people can also help you as it relates to your mental health as well. They know you very well, and, they have a listening ear. And so, you have to lean on, your support. And sometimes that can be professional support, and sometimes that's your personal support system as well.
Absolutely.
Another source of free support groups are sometimes ministries and churches. Often have support groups and counseling ministries. Also, some churches even offer counseling services. So that would be a place to seek out as well.
And also books as well. There are lots of books on, mental health, getting over grief, all types of articles. There are just a lot of resources out there to help you.
Absolutely. And if we have a couple more questions, but a question in reference to, should we seek help if we've experienced any type of trauma, or does it matter the degree or the level of difficulty in adjusting or accepting the event? Would that lead one to seek help, or should we just try to work through things on our own? Really, at what point would you recommend someone to go to seek professional help?
I think it's a case by case. When you experience trauma, you are going to have symptoms. What we see is kind of that bell curve that initially the trauma happens here, and then things escalate in terms of symptoms, and then you begin to diminish and the symptoms may dissipate. But you are going to have symptoms. You're going to feel nauseous. You're going to have diarrhea sometimes, in terms of the physical symptoms. You're not going to be able to sleep. You're going to have cognitive problems. You can't concentrate. You can't remember things. Those things are a normal response to a traumatic event. However, they should diminish over time. And when they don't diminish over time, that's when we begin to look at, okay, maybe it's time to get help. And again, the timeline for that is going to be different for everybody, depending on what the traumatic event was. But again, things are going to escalate initially. You reach a peak where it's at its worst, and then it's going to kind of begin to subside. So paying attention, yourself better than anyone else, and you have to kind of pay attention to that. But again, if things aren't diminishing, you're not feeling better, you're still not sleeping, a month later or weeks later, that's, I think, a time to seek help. Paying attention, especially to the cognitive area in terms of your thinking, your concentration, your memory, those types of things.
And the biggest thing that stands out to me is that this pandemic is traumatic on everybody.
Absolutely.
Yes.
We're all traumatized by the pandemic.
You take everything else that happens in your life, the pandemic alone is traumatic. The level of isolation that people are forced to go through. You can't, those that love to be social and go out and enjoy the arts and all, you're not able to, a lot of people are not able to engage in the things that they love anymore. And, you've got a lot of the elderly that, because of the physical challenges with everything going on, they can't really leave home, or that they're not able to partake in as many things as they want, and they're retired. And so, if you find yourself less energized, you don't have, you just are not reaching your goals at the level that you were, or, a lot of people that I know are dealing with sadness because of the pandemic. I mean, just watching all of those. I mean, I remember back when we first got in the pandemic and just all of those people in New York City. I mean, just watching that, I mean, it was just terrible. And all of us have lost a lot of loved ones due to COVID-19. And so, the pandemic alone is enough to send everybody there. So.
Absolutely.
And it's the type of trauma that is ongoing, so it's a chronic trauma, whereas some traumas, they are an event that again ends, and then you begin to recover. Well, the last year and December showed us this thing can come back and put us right back where we were in January and March and February of 2020. And so it's ongoing and repeating over and over again.
Absolutely. We're down to our last question for tonight in reference to dealing with anger that comes from trauma, which can be a hindrance to someone getting help. How would one get over that hump of being angry to then seek professional help, or to be open to getting some help, or reading books, or joining podcasts, or support groups?
Anger is a necessary emotion. It lets us know that something has occurred that was detrimental to us, or hurtful to us, or disappointing to us, or traumatic to us. And so you have to work through your anger And again, you just can't sit in the anger because it stalemates you and it prevents you from moving forward and doing the work that you need to do to heal. So understand and accept, okay, I am angry, but I can't stay here. Process what you're angry about. And again, turning that into some type of proactive action that allows you to move forward and to begin to heal. But I think sometimes we say, oh, you shouldn't be angry or don't be mad. But when something happens that is hurtful, harmful, anger is a necessary emotion. And so it's okay. It's just sometimes when we're angry, we do things that are detrimental to ourselves and to others. And so that's what you don't want to happen. You want to process the anger and move through it so that you can get to the next stage, which is going to be healing and recovery from the anger. So you're not sitting in it.
And I'll just add, I mean, you're entitled to those emotions. I think the bigger question is, how are you coping with the emotion is what is the bigger question. Because you're entitled to feel all the emotions that you feel as a result of any kind of loss or anything that you've went through, but it's all about your response to the emotion and how you're coping with it.
Absolutely. We are just overwhelmed with comments of thank yous, appreciation for having this conversation available for others to listen to. And I appreciate you both being here. This may be another one of our topics to have a part 2, because there were a lot of additional questions that were in the chat box that weren't in the question and answer queue for me to pull from. So if this becomes a part 2, just, those of you that are here, attendees, just continue to watch our social media pages and our website. We would be happy to make this a part 2 event. I thank you so much to my soror, Jonquel Neal, and to Miss S. Candy Winfield, our therapist, for being here tonight. And we do have a closing message by our co-chair of one of our co-chairs of the Physical and Mental Health Committees, Dr. Janella Burse.
Hi, good evening. Just to piggyback on what Nadia said, another phenomenal and informative discussion. Traumatic events do not define us, but they can shape us. Do not be ashamed to see a therapist. Thank you again, soror attorney Jonquel Neal, Ms. Candy Winfield, licensed professional counselor. Thank you, Dr. Nadia Barnett, my fellow co-chair, Dr. Sherry Hill, our physical and mental health chair, who cannot be with us today, Ms. Rashawn Mitchell-Jefferson, and of course, our fabulous Madam President of the Atlanta Suburban Alumni Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated, Sabrina Clark. Please join us next month on February 21st, Addiction, Substances, Food, and Everything in Between, featuring Dr. Nzinga Harrison, co-founder and chief medical officer for Eleanor Health, and our own soror, Dr. Jada Moore-Ruffin, non-surgical weight loss physician, wellness expert, and holistic medical life coach. Thank you again to the audience, especially for taking this time this evening on a day honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is definitely a day on. Please have a good night and stay safe.